Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is David Yeager, and we're thrilled to have all of you here today with us to discuss a topic that we're very excited about, one in which a great deal of progress has been made in recent years, and where there are a number of new findings that we're excited to share with you and the rest of the research community. As we all know, the notion of, quote, non-cognitive factors has garnered great attention in recent years, and it is one where we could stand to learn a great deal about how to implement some of these insights from basic science in order to hopefully create transformational change in order to address important educational problems, especially problems of inequality. And so we're thrilled to have a wonderful panel. Today we have a lot of speakers. We'll start today with Carol Dweck, who's going to provide an overview of the field, and then we'll go through a series of empirical talks where between 12 and 15 minutes, each person will present a kind of highlight of some of their most favorite findings. Then we'll end with Tony Breik from the Carnegie Foundation, who will help us think about how we move beyond these types of findings that have been helpful for building theory and learn how to integrate them with a broader educational enterprise. And so now it's my great pleasure to introduce a friend and mentor to me and many others, Carol Dweck.
Thank you, David. The people in this symposium want to change the world, and they've begun the process. They've already shaken it up by questioning and even overturning some of our cherished assumptions. First, they've questioned the assumption that student learning is just about cognitive skills and cognitive input. And they've provided some of the most dramatic evidence of the role that non-cognitive factors play in learning. Using non-cognitive factors to predict school performance and school persistence, Angela Duckworth's now classic paper showed that self-discipline outdoes IQ in predicting academic performance. Greg Walton has shown that a student's sense of belonging, the sense that they belong in school, is one of the most powerful predictors of making that transition from high school to college and thriving in college. Lisa Blackwell and I showed that measures of mindset, whether students believe that their intelligence is fixed or something they can develop, was a predictor of divergent grades across a key school transition. But the second and even more compelling insight is about changing achievement in schools, especially for underserved groups. It's no news that many schools are in bad shape. The students may live in poverty or in unsafe environments. They may lag behind in learning. The teachers may be poorly trained. Textbooks and technology may be in short supply. These are huge problems, and we must address them. But for too long, our intuition was that we could make little headway in raising student achievement until all these problems were solved. It's a very, very strong intuition that a big, complicated problem requires a big, complicated solution. However, a tremendous insight of the non-cognitive approach has been this. While these enormous problems of poverty and resources are being addressed, we can make headway, we can have impact by addressing non-cognitive factors within the student that motivate and support their achievement. Think of it this way. One of the key reasons that under-resourced environments reduce learning is that students who live in those environments come to hold toxic beliefs and toxic habits. that interfere with their motivation and achievement. For example, they may think, I can't learn well. I don't belong here in school. What's the point of school anyway? The members of this symposium have found that targeted interventions, ones that focus on these key psychological factors, even brief ones, can boost students' achievement and school performance. They have shown that a big problem can be affected by a seemingly small solution. Jeff Cohen, in his values affirmation intervention, has shown that you can make a real dent in the achievement gap, and this finding has been replicated many times by many different people. Sibel Raver, who's stuck in traffic, and we hope she arrives.
Oh, she's here.
Oh, Sibel, hi. Has shown that teaching, and you'll hear about this great work, teaching self-regulation, emotional, behavioral, cognitive self-regulation can really enhance students' early achievement. And I hear that you have new work with adolescents as well. Greg Walton has done belonging interventions that have really boosted college achievement for minorities, their post-college achievement, and as I mentioned before, have enhanced the probability that a student in high school will even make it to college, have addressed the gender gaps in science learning. In our work, we've shown that even when you don't affect the overall learning environment at all, teaching students a growth mindset can raise their achievement levels. Recently, large interventions have been undertaken by David Yeager, Dave Paunescu, in which the growth mindset intervention has been distilled into a short online learning module. We've shown that we can raise the high school achievement and course completion for even and especially the low-achieving students. We can raise the achievement of community college students and dramatically cut their dropout rate from developmental math. And in a recent study, David Yeager showed that giving entering college students a growth mindset intervention boosted the full-time enrollment, especially among minority students. So despite all the intuitions to the contrary, we can begin to address big problems with seemingly small solutions. But as Yeager and Walton have written, it's not magic. It's critical to understand when these interventions do and don't work. This includes understanding the background and culture of the students and the characteristics of the context. It involves understanding the psychological essence of the intervention and how to deliver it with fidelity, how to preserve that psychological power when it's delivered. So a lot remains to be done. We need to know more about how we can make our interventions more powerful by understanding these factors. We need to learn a lot more about how we can change the contexts by intervening with educators and parents so that they can create environments that support and enhance these potent non-cognitive factors. Today, we are lucky to hear the latest work from each of these outstanding researchers who are teaching us that we can begin to change the world starting right now.
I'm going to go first.
Next, I'd like to introduce Angela Duckworth. What's your talk called? Building Self-Control. Great. Angela Duckworth.
Great. Thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure. I'll cut to the chase because if I start talking about how wonderful they are, it's going to be 15 minutes. So my lab works on grit and self-control, and some of my lab members are here. I would thank them because they're doing all the hard work. Why do we work on grit and self-control? Well, I just came out of another session. It was on character, and one of the panelists wanted to point out that so many schools today are embracing what they're calling either non-cognitive skills or character or social-emotional learning, and there seems to be a singular focus on stuff like grit and self-control, and then he wanted to say how that was so incomplete. As a mother of a 10 and a 12-year-old and a former middle school teacher, I couldn't agree more. My lab does not work on self-control and grit because we think it is the totality of human potential, but because we find these to be extremely important determinants of effort. And if you think of achievement in the most crude terms as the product of the rate at which a kid can learn and the effort that they put forth to the learning, then you, of course, want to devote as much attention to effort as you do to anything else. Now, I want to say, as a preliminary, that talent is not a fixed quantity, as the work has clearly shown, not only the folks up here, but lots of other people who are not on the panel. And in fact, if you want to improve the rate at which you can learn something, which to me is the most useful definition of talent, where do you go? You go to the effort term as well. So I think there are many reasons to think about effort, not only because it produces short-term gains in achievement, but also in turn feeds back to talent, and therefore is important to long-term achievement as well. So self-control may be the canonical measure of self-control, or when people think about self-control, they think of the marshmallow task, where kids have to resist eating one little treat so that they can have 2 treats later on. And that, I think, can be usefully described or defined as the ability to control your attentional impulses, your emotional impulses, and your behavioral impulses in service of a longer-term goal that you hold personally worthwhile. It is not compliance with authority. It is not being browbeaten by your parents or your teachers. It is autonomous control over yourself so that you can achieve things that you find personally meaningful. Self-control is very important with temptations and distractions in the moment. Grit, by contrast, is about being faithful to a long-term goal, not over seconds, minutes, or even hours, but indeed weeks, months, years, and when we're talking about adulthood, decades. Passion and perseverance for long-term goals in the face of frustration and setbacks. So just to give you a flavor for what we're now thinking about self-control, when we asked middle school students to write down on blank pieces of paper what self-control looks like in their own everyday lives, gave us behaviors like came to class prepared, got to work right away instead of waiting until the last minute, paid attention and resisted distractions. Also interpersonal things like being polite to adults and classmates, keeping temper in check, remaining calm even when provoked. And these actually are now on the character growth card that we are helping middle schools like KIPP and others to help them give feedback, formative feedback to kids on these behaviors. In terms of intervention, I think the most successful, David asked me, he said, when you give this presentation, tell them what you think the most useful or important work that you're doing. And this work, I would love to represent as my own, but it was a collaboration with Gabrielle Ettingen and Peter Gollwitzer at NYU. And in terms of divvying up the intellectual credit, it's 100 to 0. It's 100% their intellectual work and 0% mine, but I think it's very important. Kids learned how to set goals and make plans for them. This is a worksheet that we used from the study. And I'll save you the details, but I want to say something about when we intervened. This was a group of 5th graders in New York, and in particular, we thought very intentionally about when it was that we should deliver this intervention. We did it just between the fall and the spring semester, and one of the things that I think we're continuing to worry about and to think about is when should you be intervening on growth mindset, on social belonging, with a values affirmation, in this case, a goal setting and planning, self-control intervention. So we did this because just after you get your fall grades, you're thinking, oh crap, I'm not doing very well. But just at the beginning of the spring semester, you think, oh, you know what, here's a new chance. Like I have an openness to what is possible. And in this intervention, which was roughly 45 minutes of interaction with a trained experimenter in groups of 4, followed by worksheets for 3 weeks that were given out in homeroom, we found semester-long improvements in GPA, conduct, and school attendance. Grit is the other passion in our lab, and as I said, this is more about how you sustain your effort over the long term. So the items that schools are using to measure grit in middle school are things like finishes whatever he or she began, stuck with a project or activity for more than a few weeks, stayed committed to his or her goals, tried hard even after experiencing failure, and kept working hard even when he or she felt like quitting. And just to give you a flavor for the kinds of studies we do on grit, at the National Spelling Bee, we find that if you assess grit with a questionnaire before kids actually go to Washington, D.C. to compete in the finals, and you also ask them to keep a diary of what they do, you can actually find out that the grittier kids are more likely to eventually get farther in the finals to win the National Spelling Bee. And that is actually mediated by a certain behavior. It's deliberate practice. It's working on weaknesses, not on strengths. It's working with focus. It's working with feedback, and it's actually doing that repetitively in disciplined ways over time. So we find in that study that grit predicts deliberate practice, and that predicts performance, which is consistent with the experts in the world. So when you study Olympians, you also find that they do deliberate practice. When you study world-class musicians and dancers, you find they also do deliberate practice. They identify aspects of their performance that need improving, and they focus on them. And we are working on changing beliefs about studying and practice by showing kids the evidence from science. One of the things that we've borrowed from my colleagues on the panel is this way of showing kids that there's a social norm that may not be what they think it is. So I'll see if this plays.
The TV on and text my friends when I was bored and didn't get it. But since I learned about deep practice, I realized I wasn't concentrating 100% on math. Now I study in my room and leave my phone in my bag so I don't have those distractions.
I could only find one 10-year-old whose parent was willing to consent them to have their voice shared widely, and that was my own 10-year-old, so that's my daughter, Lucy. The other thing that we're working on is how to measure the things that we think we're changing in these interventions. Oftentimes, David and Carol and I can find effects on grades, on performance on standardized tests, and that's of course wonderful, but we would love to kind of know what's in the box in between the intervention and the eventual outcomes. And we are coming up with task measures, a deliberate practice, like a math game where you can either work on math that's progressively harder and harder to put you in a zone of challenge, or if you want to, when you want to, go ahead and take a break and do any of the other fun things that you can do on the computer. And this is what it looks like when we go into schools. I'm going to here say that the credit is 100 to 0, 100% to my graduate student, Lauren Esquis-Winkler, and 0% to me. She is, as every teacher wants, her student to excel her. That's the case here. Lauren has championed this work intellectually, but also done all of the hard implementation. So in our work where we create a deliberate practice task, math games that kids can do but are intentionally designed to put them in a zone of, productive persistence or productive confusion, we find that our task measure is correlating in very nice ways with things like grit, self-control, Big Five conscientiousness, and a diary measure of how much deliberate practice kids report doing. It's not correlated with the things that it ought not be correlated with, like agreeableness or emotional stability, or even, importantly, interest in math, even though it's a math task. And then finally, it actually predicts things like grade point average from school records, even grade point average when you partial out standardized math achievement test scores, Carol's measure of growth mindset, and our own measure of frustration mindset. The way you appraise frustration. Is frustration a sign that you're stupid and you should stop, or is frustration a sign that you have placed yourself in a zone of productive challenge? So we're working on grit, we're working on self-control. There is so much that we don't know. But to end, I just want to say thank you, not only to the panelists for inspiring me, but to our school partners and our most recent funder, the Character Lab.
Thank you, Angela. Next, we have Sibel Raber. There it is. Raber. Is that one? Great. Sibel Raber.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's also wonderful to have a chance to be with this panel. We don't have a chance often to speak together and share our work together across so many different age ranges and across so many different styles of intervention. So that's a particular pleasure. So with that, I will leap in. I think where I'd like to start is actually thinking about low-income children, particularly young children. Much of the motivation for many of us is really trying to address what we call the achievement gap. 40 or 50 years ago, that achievement gap was often really associated with race and ethnicity, but increasingly that is clearly associated in the United States with income, with tremendous amount of income disparity between our richest and poorest children in the country, and a concomitant academic achievement gap that really parallels that economic disparity. And when I give talks, usually I throw up a big slide that shows children in poverty and how much that can or should change as a function of policy before I launch into things that are really primarily about children's neuroendocrine and neurocognitive function and emotional function. But because I only have such little time, I'm going to skip right through that just to say that a lot of us are really, really deeply committed to developing interventions to be able to boost low-income children's achievement. And in doing that, we often focus a bulk of our work, including work funded by states. Many of you know the huge increase in the number of pre-K programs, for example, and national funding sources from organizations like the Institute of Educational Sciences, making really major investments in early educational intervention that is very much focused on academic achievement. What's interesting is that parallel to that effort, there's been a huge similar boom in interventions targeting non-cognitive self-regulatory processes that underlie those academic skills. And one question is why this parallel interest in executive function, for example, or emotion regulation, this sort of skyrocketing interest in this area called executive function. I think that the reason is that the topics that Angela just spoke about make immense sense, and also because there's a huge amount of really compelling neurocognitive and neurobiological data to support why we might want to focus on systems other than just children's ability to decode language, for example, or their ability to rotate spatially, cognitively when addressing a math problem. So specifically, when we think about self-regulation, many of us think about it in two domains. We really think about cognitive self-regulation, where from a developmental science or a neuroscience perspective, we really focus on something called executive functions. How many of you have heard big buzz or do work in executive functions? Yes, so what are executive functions, or what is executive function? It's always this big question given the fuzziness of the two words. Executive and function are not imminently graspable or translatable in a public sphere. In our work, executive function is basically defined by three things: children's ability to focus and maintain and then shift their attention, children's ability to really draw on information that they've just learned through working memory, and children's ability to demonstrate inhibitory control, basically the form of controlling impulses that Angela just described. A classic example of this is asking children to do something that is in conflict with what their prepotent or their natural response might be. So a big example that we use is when I tap my pencil one time, I want the child to tap his pencil 2 times. And when I tap my pencil 2 times, he has to tap his pencil 1 time. So when I just gave that instruction, what do children have to do? They have to really focus, right? If they're spacing out somewhere, they just missed half of the instruction. What else do they have to do? They really have to remember, right? They have to actually keep all that information in mind. And the third thing that they have to do is they have to really restrain themselves from just tapping the heck out of the table with their pencil, right? Or doing exactly what I just did, which is when I tap twice, sometimes they tap twice, and they would be scored wrong because they didn't inhibit the prepotent impulse to just tap the way I tapped. But instead, they have to pull on that inhibitory control and tap the opposite. That's just one simple task. There's lots of computer-based tasks we use that are often really fun to do with both adults and kids that are experienced actually as game-like, but really do help to train and support inhibitory control. At any rate, we clearly find, as Angela just mentioned, that executive function in early childhood predicts, for example, math and reading substantially over and above IQ and processing speed. So it's not simply that executive functions are picking up on things that we think of as intelligence or processing speed. The second piece of regulatory behavior or regulatory function that I really want to focus on, the first was really located in the brain in the prefrontal cortex. This other section of the world of self-regulation is really buried much deeper in the brain, the old limbic part of the brain, in the anterior cingulate and the amygdala. And that's really focusing on children's ability to regulate their emotions. And why would we care about regulating their emotions in the context of learning? Well, it turns out in the short term, how you feel in terms of your general physiological arousal matters a lot for your ability to attend, your ability to remember, and your ability to inhibit your impulses. So after just driving at breakneck speed down 95 after being in a very massive amount of traffic, it's no wonder that not only am I shaking like a leaf, but I'm having a hard time remembering the things that I usually say, right? I'm having a hard time not raking my hand through my hair to regulate. In fact, I just kind of keep calm and carry on, right? So that notion that you have to down-regulate in order to produce cognitively effortful work is something that we really know in the short term. And we think about that a lot in terms of what my colleague Clancy Blair points to, the Yerkes-Dodson law of arousal. You want to be at a moderate level of arousal. If you're low in arousal, you're kind of sleepy and not that engaged. If you're super maxed out on arousal, it's very hard for you to attend, to use your working memory, and to really manage those impulses. So in the short term, we know that moderate arousal really does support executive function, while high negative arousal is disruptive to attention and working memory in the moment. What is that relevant to? Highly relevant to the work of my colleagues who do a tremendous amount on how kids can actually modulate their anxiety so that they're actually able to cognitively function more proactively in situations that demand a lot of effort. The second, though, is actually over the longer time course, where we have a lot of work to suggest that kids exposed to high levels of arousal at both physiological and behavioral levels in terms of exposure to violence, exposure to stress in the household, exposure to high amounts of stress in the environment, have disrupted neuroendocrine function in terms of what's called the HPA axis, which actually is associated with executive function and the development of executive function over time. So that kids experiencing high levels of wear and tear, exposed to a high number of poverty-related stressors, consistently have more difficulty with executive function on average. Not that some kids don't flourish, and not that other kids don't happen to avoid these outcomes, but some kids really do struggle as a function of their exposure to poverty-related risk. The implications for later life outcomes and the interest in executive function is really because of, I think, new findings suggesting long-term benefit or covariance between executive function and kids' outcomes. And I've just flashed them on the screen, but basically lower rates of criminal conviction, for example. So in my remaining 4 minutes, I'm going to race through a bunch of findings that suggest how we look at this. This is particularly on poverty, where you can see the number of years of poverty are associated with executive function in a way that suggests environmental insult, and then clearly some example from interventions supporting kids' executive function that suggest that executive function is malleable in terms of repair. So here from our own study, the Chicago School Readiness Project, which is now several years old, we found that when we intervened in classrooms to support teachers in maintaining a more positive emotional climate where children were developing skills in emotional and behavioral self-control, we found significant gains in terms of kids' executive function and, nicely, significant gains in terms of kids' academic outcomes without giving any additional training to teachers for academic subjects. So we didn't help teachers in how to train reading, but in supporting kids' self-regulation, kids showed clear gains in their vocabulary and early math. New findings from colleagues, one wonderful colleague at NYU, Lori Miller-Brotman, with interventions implemented both in homes and in preschools and early child care settings, suggests that when you intervene with parents and teachers, you get really huge bang for your buck in terms of shifts in kids' executive function and emotion regulation and in their academic achievement, with clear evidence because they find improvements in kids' HPA axis function in terms terms of their cortisol, in terms of this idea of a biomediator, that kids are actually on the better road in terms of their physiology, not just in terms of their information management, in terms of their abilities to think or their ability to problem solve. And she finds actually fascinating findings in terms of kids' health, in terms of kids' obesity, lower rates of obesity for kids in the Parent Core intervention. We find really nice, beautiful findings from Tools of the Mind curriculum. That Tools is a intervention that is implemented across a 2-year preschool or sometimes in a kindergarten setting. In this case, it was in the kindergarten, where a carefully scripted curriculum that really emphasizes working memory, inhibitory control, planning, and higher order reasoning, primarily through children's own activities involving pretend play, for example, involving planning with a peer, how they're going to solve a problem. Those kinds of tasks, when paired with teacher practices that support emotional and behavioral self-regulation, not just really good classroom management, we found, and others have found, really clear evidence for gains in attention, in working memory, and then concomitant gains in math and reading. And you can see our gains are largest for kids in high poverty schools. So in my remaining work, I just thought I'd mention the extent to which we can think about executive function and emotion regulation, these paired systems working in adolescence. Executive function and emotion regulation are really important in adolescence as kids basically transition to these worlds that have what we think of as really upping the ante. There are much greater cognitive demands on middle schoolers, as Angela just pointed out, in terms of managing their own time, managing their own productivity, really engaging those cognitive skills that I mentioned in terms of attention, in terms of impulse control, or basically not working to maintain that level of self-control. And what's important is that that's in a context where we actually expect a lot more autonomy from kids. So children are actually, suddenly there is no homeroom teacher in adolescence. Kids are moving from classroom to classroom, really having to manage themselves in the hallway, in the classroom, and in the, on the way home. We find similar, parallel, dramatic changes in children's neurocognitive and emotional development with a clear evidence of the increase of the role of emotional arousal. Specifically, we can think about anxiety in the context of performance and with peers, and also adolescents' notorious sensitivity to reward or risk. Skateboarding down a banister or a set of stairs sounds like a great idea. That sense that the thrill or the immediate reward totally outweighs the cost or the potential consequence is key. So I just point you to some interventions that are currently in that area. My colleague Stephanie Jones and another colleague Elliot Berkman, who are just doing fantastic work with clear evidence from fMRI work in Berkman's case of shifts in brain function that parallel or go with the intervention. So implications for education research, simply that these serve as really excellent candidate mechanisms or levers for supporting children, both from the behavioral costs and the academic costs of poverty, given the risk of poverty-related stressors. And simultaneously, this lever can be switched the other way to really support children's outcomes through interventions implemented at the classroom level. And we find that they yield moderate to large effects when measured at the neurobiological, at the neuroendocrine, at the behavioral, and at academic levels. We're using currently an interesting model, I think, for young parents in young adulthood, essentially, trying to affect kids' executive function and mom's executive function through an innovative intervention using video feedback. Can we actually lower kids' arousal and mom's arousal in the context of stressful interaction so that they can both be on better footing for being able to process information and remember it when they are faced new challenges? And just to highlight multiple neuropsychological mechanisms, including inhibitory control, fear, anxiety in the context of threat, particularly violence inside the home and outside in schools, and sensitivity to reward and assessment of risk. So with that, I'll just skip to say thank you so much, and it's been a good chance to downregulate in front of a lot of people in 12 minutes.
Sybil, it's just thrilling to have you here, and Angela too. This is it's just among the most important work in the field. And I think, just before I start, I think one thing that's so important for me, at least personally, about the work is that what you highlight is that often these executive functions or self-control, they're not different explanations than poverty for underachievement. They're in many cases the mediator. It's the why of how inequality in resources leads to inequality in achievement. And precisely intervening on the mediator can in some cases sever the relationship between the prior risk and the later outcomes. And I think that as a general principle, that type of work has been inspiring for me. And here you've shown it in early childhood, and there was a transition in the talks now where we're looking at later in adolescence with a similar idea. What are the factors that the educational environment or the home environment might cause in a kid to lead them to be disengaged and demonstrate less self-regulation, and how might we precisely intervene with that? So thank you for that. So in my remarks, what I'd like to share is some new work that I've done, but that builds on the great work done by many others, some interview and theoretical work done by Bill Damon and others, some amazing experimental work done by Chris Holloman and Judy Herrick-Kavitz. And it's on this more general idea of this. One of the most common statements that a kid makes is that we give them problems like this, and they say, why would I do that? What's the point of doing that? And as a middle school teacher, I had the unfortunate job of giving kids lots of worksheets that I couldn't sufficiently explain why they should do them and learn from them. Here we have factoring trinomials. I'm not a mathematician. My mathematician friends assure me that none of them do this in their actual jobs, and yet we have students do this for years or months. And the students could legitimately ask, and it's kind of hard to legitimately answer the question of why should they do this. Yet throughout our educational careers, we have to make choices. Why should we not go quickly through our work? Why should we deeply learn from it? Let's think about the context of a teenager who's given an assignment where it's kind of hard to answer the why question for them. What are they concerned about? And teenagers are concerned about a lot of things, but as a developmental psychologist, we've narrowed in on a few key concerns. One is an extremely high concern for injustice. Intuitively, anyone who's spent a lot of time with teenagers knows the easiest thing to have a teenager say is that's not fair. They're very, very attentive to unfairness in their own lives and in the lives of others, and so that's something that they might say when given an assignment. There's also this concern about mattering, that is, having a place in the world. Jackie Eccles has written beautifully about this. This notion that a meaningless life is not a life teenagers want to live, and asking students to do worksheet after worksheet of trinomials doesn't help them answer the question of why you should live a meaningful life. We also know that teenagers have a heightened reactance to adult attempts to control autonomy. So it's not the case that young kids and older adults don't care about autonomy, but teenagers are especially attuned to this. Now, if you think of these, there are many other concerns that are developmentally appropriate, but if you think about these as a composite, it's kind of a perfect storm for teenagers rejecting many of the assignments that we give them to learn in our classrooms. And an intuition that our research group had is that typically this is a reason why kids don't do the work. Could we turn this on its head? That is, would it be possible to help kids see their work as a chance to address an injustice, as an opportunity to matter, and as a chance to reject the kind of the unfair state of affairs that has been created in adult society, that is to matter and to make a personally important choice. And so we've tried to do this in something we're calling a purpose for learning. There's a long set of people who've influenced this work. We've tried to distill it into an experimental paradigm in recent years. And we're defining it simply as a motive for learning that's both intended to convey some benefit to the self, that is, that you see it as good for you, which education is kind of unambiguously at least supposed to be. It's supposed to be a preparation for your future life or job, but also simultaneously having some kind of contribution to the world beyond the self that is connected meaningfully to some either a cause or an idea or an ideal. And that is that we think of a purpose as having both a self-oriented and a self-transcendent component. And in some early correlational work with Matt Bundick, we found that teenagers who endorse both of these ideas when thinking about their future tend to find their homework and their schoolwork in general more personally meaningful. And so a research question that motivated us was whether a self-transcendent purpose for learning might promote meaning in life and might promote, more concretely, performance on the kinds of tasks that Sibel mentioned and that Angela has mentioned. That is, could it be possible that kids would put their own immediate self-interest out of the way for a minute if they're thinking about how they might, if they truly learn from this content, how they might contribute to others around the world? Okay. We have a number of correlational studies. I'll show you an early experimental study and then a couple interventions. So first is, okay, well, perhaps we might be able to measure a purpose for learning. Teenagers might have more or less of this, but how could you create it? In fact, a purpose is a very personally generated idea. It's something that is very individual, and perhaps teens would react with disgust if we try to tell them what their purpose was. But some great work, as I mentioned, by Chris Hulleman and Judy Harakavitz has found that often teens have more ideas for their purposes in lives than we sometimes give them credit for. That is, that young people are meaning makers, and they're looking for ways to connect and to do something that matters. And if we just ask them to make up a reason why learning in school in general, or in this class in particular, might be relevant to someone that they care about or themselves, then they can do that. And even if it's not a plausible reason, it can perhaps create the sense that the work is meaningful. And so we did a version of this. We did this with UT undergrads. I'll show you high school students and community college students later. It's a brief web-based questionnaire. Students think they're just completing a survey. But it's designed to, it's built on a foundation of social psychological studies of persuasion. That is, ways to maximally change beliefs with a minimal number of minutes and a minimal nudge. That it's almost an imperceptible persuasive mechanism. So the first thing we do, as I mentioned, is it's easy to get young people to talk about injustices. We just simply ask them to write about an injustice. It says, the first prompt is, sometimes the world is unjust. Nearly everyone at some time in their lives sees this and thinks the world could be better in one way or another. What are some problems that you think about that might relate to skills you're getting in college? They write about that for a few minutes. Then they see survey results. They're told that we did, and we did in fact do this, a scientific survey of students coming from Stanford University. And we asked these students, why do you learn? And they, of course, everyone said they want to make money or have a good job. But when it really got down to it, when they really talked about the real reasons why they made tough choices, it was for some deeply personal reason. And many of them hadn't thought about it or put it into words until we asked them. But when they did, there were reasons like wanting to be an educated person that could have something intelligent to say about the world, wanting to make a positive contribution to the world, wanting to gain knowledge so that they can have a career they personally enjoy. Then students read a series of normative quotes. This is a social norms manipulation coming out of some social psychological research. Students read quotes that were kind of cobbled together from focus groups and interviews we'd done in advance. Here's one example. Supposedly in response to the question, why do you do your schoolwork? A student said, for me, getting an education is all about learning things that will help me do something I can feel good about, something that matters for the world. I used to do my homework just to get a better grade and look smart. I still think doing well in school is important, but for me, it's definitely not just about a grade anymore. I'm growing up, and doing well in school is all about preparing myself to do something that matters, something I care about. And then students write their own version of this. So they see the examples and then they produce their own. Notice the manipulation doesn't talk about math in particular. It doesn't talk about any specific content area, any specific objective. So it doesn't actually give them a reason for doing, for instance, trinomials. It's more about why should you stay in the game of education and keep learning in it. In this study, we wanted to measure immediate self-regulation, and so we drew on a task that Angela Duckworth's lab, together with Sydney DeMello's lab, has developed. It's called the boring math task. So there's unbearably tedious math that students can do, and they're told that it's good for them, that it'll keep their brain fresh. and they get a link to an article published in Science showing that people rely on technology too much, and so the brain is atrophying. Or they're told, but by the way, you don't have to. You can just click on the right side and watch games, or do math. But you should probably try to do a little math. But if you want, you can play Tetris. And so here's a little demo. We'll see if the audio works. So you type in your name, and then you click start, and then you have the opportunity to do the math, and then it counts the number of really boring single-digit subtraction problems that you do. And then students can say, well, I've had enough. I think I want to watch a video. Well, what should I pick? How about Call Me Maybe? Okay, that sounds kind of awesome. And then, and then they watch Call Me Maybe, and then they decide, like, should I go back and do my math, or should I watch, like, LeBron James dunk a basketball, or whatever? Okay, so the software tracks the number of math problems that they complete and the number of videos that they watch. And everyone in this room, I'm sure, is familiar with this modern dilemma, right? It's like, do I review this paper, or do I check, the news, or the funny thing on Facebook right now? And so what we're going to look at here is across 2 trials. It's not surprisingly, the more you do, the more bored you are. And what you see is that in the control, students could kind of deal with it the first time, but then they do about half as much math in the second trial. And then you see the same kind of result for tempting videos watched. So in the first trial, they only try 1, and then they watch, on average, another half video in the second trial. So they're kind of, this is a measure, this slope is a measure of self-regulation. What you see is that students who wrote about a beyond the self purpose for learning, however, showed a weaker decline. So they're able to maintain self-regulation, producing a significant effect by the second trial. And the same was true for tempting videos watched. And this is something we replicated in a number of additional studies. So if students are sticking with kind of boring work that it's hard to see the point of in the face of tempting alternatives, then maybe this would add up over time to overall differences in courses that they might feel are boring or uninteresting. And so we did one study. This is with the PERTS program. You can go to www.perts.net, and your school or schools you work with might participate in this as well. 9th grade students went to the computer lab, and they completed the purpose intervention I just told you. We did the same study with 2 different community colleges. There's another condition there, I'll tell you about it. So as I mentioned, students completed the purpose intervention or not. They thought the study was over, but the school registrar was participating with us, and then we got student level grades for these students several months later. So we could look at the effect on overall GPA. And so this is high school science and math GPA. And what you see is that for all students, there's a small but statistically significant effect on quarter 4 STEM courses. It was largest for the lowest achievers, which is a theme that comes up a lot in psychological intervention studies. In the community college setting, we see another effect. In this study, we crossed purpose with the growth mindset. This is the idea that, my brain can grow, crossed with the idea of why should my brain grow. And what you see, well, where are the findings? Those are the findings. What you see is that in the control, students have a low GPA in math, a 1.63 out of 4. Growth mindset alone, there's a modest, non-significant improvement. Purpose alone, modest, non-significant improvement. But in the combined cell, there's around a 0.3 grade point improvement for students who completed the purpose intervention. Okay, so we're spending a lot of time, as we should, making the coursework worth learning, right? So if trinomials are not useful, then we should remove them from our curriculum. But it's a fallacy, I think, to think that materials are objectively relevant. They're relevant to people for purposes. And sometimes we forget the people in that equation. And it's possible sometimes with similar or slightly revised curriculum to have students benefit more from that same kind of content. And this, of course, has great implications as we're engaging in an overhaul of our curriculum in response to new assessments from the Common Core. And growing out of this work and past work, it seems helpful to help kids generate a personally relevant self-transcendent purpose for learning. We have other data where these motives seem to be most important for the lowest income kids. And this is exactly counter to what in a survey of national teachers that they said they should do for low-income kids. That is, people think of as the best motivational strategy for low-income kids is to have them think about all the income they'll have in the future if they stay in school. That does not predict good outcomes for these kids. In fact, for the lowest income kids in our sample, believing that they're going to contribute to the country or to the community by learning, by actually acquiring knowledge, that's what predicted greater self-regulation. And where we're headed now is to try to understand more beyond this causal demonstration, how can we create a culture in which teachers day to day promote this type of purposeful thinking. Thank you very much. Next, we have Jeff Cohen, and then after that, Greg Walton and Tony Bragg. Which one is yours? Great.
So thank you, everyone, for coming today, and thank you to David and Carol and my co-panelists for presenting today. This is an exciting time for psychology because it's making a lot of inroads into the world of education and educational policy. And I'm going to touch upon a few studies that my colleagues and I have conducted and just sort of go through them from a bird's eye perspective to give you a flavor of some of the kind of work that we've done. And all this work is in close collaboration with my friends and colleagues, Julio Garcia, Val Purdy-Vaughns, David Yeager, Greg Walton, David Sherman, and Kevin Bidding. And before I dive into this specific examples of intervention studies that we've conducted, I wanted to make two very general points abstracting outward from some of the specific findings that were discussed today. The first point is that simply different folks, different students can see the same classroom differently. Subjective construal matters. So even when the objective classroom situation is the same for two students, the subjective landscape of that experience can differ radically as a function of whether students feel that school has a higher purpose for them or not, as a function of whether or not students conceive of intelligence as fixed or malleable. The classroom experience can differ as a function of whether a student is a minority in the classroom and wonders if they belong or not, or if they could be stereotyped. Subjective experience differs, and this is a really, really big idea that's in some ways hard to get, but just so important. I think one of the general ambitions of this work is that when educators see a chronically underperforming or misbehaving child, they won't so readily jump to the conclusion that it must be due to some deficit in the kid, but instead give some allowance to the possibility that their subjective experience of the classroom may differ, and that difference may repeatedly recur. That's the first point, that subjective construal matters, the big take-home point. The second take-home point is that psychological experience can be harnessed for educational gain, as some of the talks here today illustrated. One of my favorite examples of this as a case study is work by Mark Lepper on expert human tutors. Now, as many of you know, if you have an intervention that produces about a 0.3 standard deviation gain in student achievement, and if it can do so consistently, you're golden. That's actually pretty good. What's fascinating is that expert tutors can consistently produce educational gains among at-risk students of 2 standard deviations. How do they do it? What do they do? Mark Lepper videotaped these expert tutors in action and went and analyzed them at a real micro level to kind of get at what they were doing. And his discovery was that they're paying a lot of attention to students' psychology. In addition to thinking about the instruction and conveying the material, it's almost as though they have a barometer into the kid's emotional state. And they're not doing one thing. Instead, what the expert tutors are doing are a lot of small things that speak volumes psychologically. For example, one clever tactic that the expert tutors use is to say things like, instead of giving the kids praise, they're actually pretty stingy with praise, they'll say things like, wow, the next problem coming up, that's going to be really hard. I don't know if you'll be able to do it. I don't know if I could do it. And what that does is it creates an attributional frame so that if the kid then struggles on the problem, they can attribute it to the difficulty of the work. But if they succeed, as they often do under the guidance of the expert tutor, it's doubly affirming, doubly rewarding. So the expert tutors are kind of creating a psychological safety zone where students feel comfortable taking the risk and trying to learn. Another thing the expert tutors do that's just fascinating is that whereas inexpert tutors just get down to business and they're pretty didactic, the expert tutors, 90% of their utterances are questions, as if they're drawing out from the child with well-timed, well-tailored questions the knowledge that they can produce on their own, so the kid has a sense of their own autonomy as they're completing the work. Now, what we try to do in our research is to bottle the tactics of expert teachers, exceptional tutors, success stories that are out there in the real world, and try to distill them to their essence and figure out what they are and what they're doing, and then bring them and then test them rigorously with the hope that then we will be able to disseminate them more widely to educators perhaps throughout the nation. So we do this in very small ways. I'll tell you about two interventions that do this. One is wise criticism. The other is values affirmation. So wise criticism, this is work under the lead of David Yeager. And what we're interested in this work is how to convey constructive critical feedback without undermining the student's motivation to succeed. And what we did in this study was to have students write an essay. We created a module with teachers, and students under this module wrote an essay, and then they got critical feedback on their essay from their teachers. And in one intervention condition, the kids were told by their teacher via a note appended to the first page of the feedback, look, your essay is as far as it goes, but judged by a higher standard, it falls short. Remember, I wouldn't go to the trouble of giving you this feedback if I didn't think you are capable of meeting a higher standard. And so that was the intervention. And what it does is to change the meaning of critical feedback. So now, rather than a judgment of your ability, it becomes an affirmation of your potential. I'm giving you this critical feedback because I believe in you. It's almost like psychological jujitsu. It takes a negative and turns it into a positive. And what we find is that consistently this intervention improves the performance of academically at-risk students, in this case African American students. Here we're looking at the percentage of students revising their essay, whereas white students, 75% revise their essay. Black students in the control, only 17% revise their essay. But black students who get this intervention, 71% revise it. And in some ways, this seems mysterious. It's just a little note that conveys, hey, I have high standards. From an objective point of view, it's a small intervention. But from a subjective point of view, from the perspective of a student under threat, it's a big, or it can be a big intervention to know that someone believes in you. To make a long story short, I'm going to tell you very quickly about another intervention that David did where he taught students to reinterpret criticism. What we did is just to expose students in high school, this was a poor high school, to information that led them to see critical feedback from their teachers as a sign of their teachers' high standards and belief in them through testimonials from senior students. And if we look at the percentage of black students, the percentage of courses that they fail, 43% of their courses they're failing in the control condition, but for black students in the intervention condition, that's almost cut in half, so that the percentage of courses that they're failing falls to 23%. And this gets at a general principle of intervention that if you can change something that repeatedly recurs, like the feedback interaction and students' interpretation of it, the effects, the benefits can compound, almost like baseball averages across a season or a career. Values affirmation. One of the things that the expert tutors do, in Mark Lepper's research, which is interesting, is that whereas the inexpert tutors get down to business right away and then start getting into the material, the expert tutors take some time up front to get to know the kids. They ask them about their hobbies and their values and their interests. And what this does is to create a sort of space of belongingness for the kid so that they feel a sense of rapport and inclusion that then gives them a sort of psychological safety zone so that they can take the risk to try. So values affirmation uses a similar technique. What we did in these studies, these are all randomized controlled trials, is to have students at the beginning of the year, they completed a writing assignment where they reflected on an important value that they held. And these were assignments passed out by their teachers as part of a regular classroom exercise. And here are some excerpts from what kids wrote. For instance, one kid wrote, "Dance is my passion, my life. My second home is the dance studio. My second family is my dance team. My family and friends are so important to me, even more than dance. My family, I can't live without them. My friends, I am my real self around them. I can be silly, goofy, and weird, and they don't care. They accept me for who I am." This is an excerpt that the kid wrote in the affirmation exercise. Another kid wrote, "If I didn't have my family, I wouldn't be raised right. And if I didn't have my friends, I would be a boring person. If I didn't have my religion, I wouldn't know what to do. I would be lost." It seems like a small intervention, but it's subjectively big. In a sense, kids have been preparing their whole life for this moment, this experience, because they're bringing to the fore a lifelong thing of meaning. And rather than checking it at the door of the school, they're bringing it into the classroom. They do this over and over throughout the year. We time the interventions to occur at the beginning of the year and then to coincide with key stressors during adolescence. And to make a long story short, I'll just give some highlights. White students, if we look at the percentage of students failing the course where the intervention was given after the first quarter, very few white students are failing. Black students in the control, 20% are failing that course, but for black students in the affirmation condition, only 9% are. And it's exciting to think about these kinds of interventions epidemiologically. Maybe if we give this kind of intervention to 1 million kids, we could cut the number of kids failing their courses by 100,000, maybe. But first we have to figure out when, where, and for whom these interventions work, because they won't work all the time. They're highly context dependent, as David mentioned. So, then, one of the interesting things about psychological interventions is that they can then piggyback on structural channels. So if we look at the percentage of low-performing students placed in a remedial track or retained in grade in a 2-year window, black students in the control, 18% are placed in remediation, whereas black students in the affirmation, only 5% are. So a psychological benefit turns into a structural reality. And you can understand how this might occur if a kid performs better early in the school year, their teachers see them as having more potential, and because of that, the teacher enrolls them in a more advanced track, and the student is deflected from a failure channel they might otherwise be shunted down. It's like a nuclear reaction in the right time and the right place. There's a little bit of a burst of achievement early on in the school year, and the whole system can respond to sustain that benefit. I'm going to skip this. One of the discoveries that we've had in this work is that school is incredibly recursive. The outcome of one transition can affect the outcome of later transitions, as encapsulated in this quote by Glenn Elder, who wrote that early transitions can have enduring consequences by affecting subsequent transitions even after many years and decades have passed. They do so through behavioral consequences that set in motion accumulating advantages and disadvantages. So if I succeed in middle school and I'm put on the advanced track, then I might be more likely to be in more demanding courses. I might be more likely to apply to college, and I might be more likely, if I apply to college, to actually get in. One thing leads to another. Good outcomes beget better outcomes. Bad outcomes beget worse outcomes. In the right time and in the right place, under the right conditions, early small benefits can cascade forward. So we looked at this by submitting students' names to the Student Clearinghouse and getting data on their actual college enrollment. And what we find is that for Black students, the affirmation 7 years later increased the rate in which they were being officially enrolled in college by 11 percentage points. It's not the case that this kind of intervention will work everywhere and every place, but if it creates that initial spark, and if other conditions are in place, such as the opportunities for growth in the classroom, that initial spark can kindle into a fire of later advantages. Okay, I want to close just by making two big picture points very quickly. First, what we do with these interventions, what all of us do with these interventions, is send the kinds of messages that expert teachers and tutors are sending all the time in word and deed in heterogeneous ways in the classroom to their students. They are continually conveying the message that you belong, you can do it, and you have value. In little and big ways, that psychological message is sent. And our interventions are capturing in a small way a reliable piece of that message. The second key point is that these interventions are not panaceas. They're not magic bullets, as David and Greg are fond of pointing out. They are like catalysts. If other things are in the environment, the kid has aptitude to do better. There are resources for growth and learning in the environment. These kinds of interventions can enable students to take the risks to approach and have the kind of agency that will enable them to benefit from them more. So both structural and psychological interventions are both necessary. Neither is sufficient. And in the right time and in the right place, an intervention like this and like others can change a trajectory, change a life, and maybe even change the course of history in the right time and right place. Thank you.
It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here today with you and to be with this wonderful panel. I'm going to speak about students' feelings of belonging in school, how they understand events in school that speak to their belonging, and how we can use this to help improve students' outcomes, especially at-risk and disadvantaged students. I'm going to focus in particular on the transition to college, on the experience that students have when they go from high school to college. And I think it's worth noting a divergence between how we talk often in policy circles when we read the New York Times about the transition to college, and what we actually think about when we think about what is it really like for a student who's making that transition. So usually when we talk about college in public policy circles, we talk about things like academic preparation and financial aid. Do kids have the academic requirements that they need? Are they ready for college? Do they have the money, the resources that they need to be able to pursue college? And obviously these are very important things, but the story doesn't end there. For a student going to college, there's a lot more than academic preparation and money. There's more to college than that. In fact, that's just a kind of a precondition for kids to be able to get in the door of college, but to be able to actually stick and to be able to succeed in college, kids need more than just the money and the preparation. In fact, if we look at kids, low-income kids, minority kids, often they don't do well in college even when they have the resources and the academic background. So what do kids need more? One thing that they need is they also need adaptive mindsets to understand the challenges that they're going to experience in college, the personal, social, academic challenges that they'll experience in college, and they need to know how they can overcome those challenges. And this is especially the case when students are going into foreign social and cultural environments, when they're going into settings where their group traditionally hasn't been, their group is underrepresented, where people like them are in the minority, people like them are suspect or negatively labeled in one way or another. This is a woman in the 1980s writing in her senior thesis at the end of her tenure at Princeton University. She writes, "My experiences at Princeton have made me far more aware of my blackness than ever before. No matter how liberal and open-minded some of my white professors and classmates try to be toward me, I sometimes feel like a visitor on campus, as if I really don't belong. It often seems as if to them I'll always be black first and a student second." And what you hear in this quote is not an assertion of non-belonging. It's not a statement, I just don't belong here. It's an unsettledness, it's a questioning, it's a wondering about whether I belong. And she's writing this, as I said, in her senior thesis after having spent 4 years at Princeton, 4 years during which time you might have thought that those questions might have been settled. This is our First Lady, Michelle Robinson Obama, writing in 1985. And if students who are successful and who we look up to as much as Michelle can have this experience, this unsettledness, this questioning, this worrying, this pervasive worrying about belonging, then I think it may be a common experience for many students indeed. Jeff and I use the term belonging uncertainty to describe this. And it's the notion that often when we go into new environments, when we go into new social and academic settings, take a new job, start a new school, we often ask ourselves whether we belong in that setting, if other people are going to respect us, value us, if they're going to be friendly with us, if they're going to want to participate with us in work groups. But those worries loom largest when we are going into settings where our group is negatively stereotyped or targeted by stigma, where there are group-based reasons for us to ask ourselves whether we belong, and then to re-ask ourselves and re-ask ourselves. And what that uncertainty does, what that question in the back of your mind, do I belong, do I belong, do I belong, what that does is it guides how you interpret and respond to negative events in school. So if something bad happens, if you get excluded from a dinner outing, and you're asking yourself implicitly in the back of your mind, is this a place where I belong, is this a place where I belong? It can seem like that event, that exclusion from the dinner outing is proof that you don't belong. It wasn't just a bad thing, those people didn't just diss you tonight, but it's proof you don't belong maybe in general in this college. And that's a really bad inference to draw if you're going to be able to stay motivated in school. So that's a potential target for intervention, to change the meaning that students impute to a negative event like that, to the day-to-day slings and arrows that all of us go through in demanding school and work environments. And the goal of that intervention then would be to try to forestall these global inferences of non-belonging, to help people sustain their feelings of belonging even when bad stuff happens. So in our past work, we tested this in the intervention. This was a study with college students. They were in their second semester of college. And the goal was to give students a more optimistic and hopeful narrative with which to interpret negative social experiences in school. And so we gave students stories from upper year students that basically conveyed in various different forms that everybody worries at first about whether they belong in college. Everybody sometimes gets left behind when their friends go out for dinner. But with time, people find their niche, they find their way, they come to feel at home. And this is designed to prevent students from attributing those daily adversities to a permanent lack of belonging, to help them get a toehold in the social and academic environment, to build relationships that might help them achieve over time. This intervention lasted an hour in students' freshman year. It raised African American students' GPA from sophomore through senior year, reducing the achievement gap by half. In subsequent work, we found it also has strong benefits for women in male-dominated engineering majors. And yet, it's a limited intervention in that form in a number of ways that are very important. It's given on a almost one-on-one basis with students as they are in their busy lives in school. And so we asked ourselves the question, we asked, would it be possible to take the insights of that intervention that was delivered to students while they're in college, while they're going through these difficulties, while there's bad stuff that's going on in their lives that they need to understand, could we give it to them in advance? Could we give it to them before they come to college? Could we give people a kind of psychological roadmap? So that's what we tried to do in the next set of studies that I want to share with you today. These are interventions that are delivered pre-enrollment, before students have actually showed up on campus. And the idea is to help students anticipate challenges they'll encounter in college and ways to overcome them. This approach gives us the opportunity for wide-scale or large-scale dissemination. It's possible through pre-orientation programming to reach entire cohorts of students with online exercises. We did 3 different trials, and I'm going to share with you just highlights of these 3, a partnership with charter schools and 2 full-scale university partnerships. First, the work with college-going urban charter students was a collaboration with David Yeager, Angela Duckworth, Donald Commence, Laura Keene, Dave Ponescu. It was funded by the Gates Foundation, and it was run through the PERTS platform at Stanford. We went through an extensive R&D process to understand the experiences of these charter school students as they were thinking about approaching and going into college. That ultimately led us to revise and optimize the intervention materials. Working with the design school at Stanford, we conducted interviews with the students. We had brainstorming sessions. Students drew journey maps of their experiences into and through college. Working again with the D School, we synthesized these qualitative reports into initial hypotheses that we transcribed. We met to discuss these and brainstorm. We used more interviews and focus groups to test our initial ideas, expand upon them, and we distilled the ideas into candidate improvements in the materials, which we then rewrote. Here we are at the design school, beginning this work. And this process ultimately led us to identify several key themes that we used to revise the intervention. First, an important theme was that students seemed to lack agency for creating belonging in college, instead believing that belonging was something that might just happen to them. They coming from often highly controlled charter school environments in which they've known not only their peers, but often their teachers for many, many years. They exit that environment that has served them well, but they are ill-equipped for the wide, wide world, the sort of wild west of college. One student described this to me. She said between classes, she'd be waiting for her brother to finish class, and she would sit in her car, and she would feel lonely, and she would look out on the campus, and she would see students walking around with each other, and she would ask herself, how did they get to know each other? How did they meet? It was heartbreakingly sad to hear her talk about this, to hear her sit there with sit on her hands essentially, and not actually go out, meet somebody, find a student group, join a group that seemed interesting, go out and engage in that world. So in the intervention, we revised to explain active steps kids need to take to make connections to other people in college. Second, students tended to believe that friendships in college are casual, and these friendships are just distracting. I'm in college to do me, not to party. So we wanted to encourage students to build these, even these weak social ties by talking about their utility for students experiencing college. Finally, students thought that instructors in college just don't care as much as those in charter schools. And so we wanted to explain to students that in college, teachers show they care by borrowing from Jeff's work and David's work. They show they care by giving you really tough, critical, nasty, critical feedback, because that's how they help you learn and grow. Okay, we evaluated this with charter graduates from Mastery charter schools here in Philadelphia. These are almost all African-American first-generation students, all of whom were admitted to a 4- or 2-year college. They completed their intervention materials in the school computer lab at the end of their senior year of high school. There was a growth mindset intervention crossed with a social belonging intervention. Growth mindset turned out to be redundant in this context because this charter school environment was infused with those messaging. The outcome was continuous college enrollment in the first year. So kids saw things like this: you're finishing high school, you're going to college, you're excited, you probably have lots of questions about what to expect. Here they are completing the materials in the school computer lab. They completed saying is believing exercises to drive home the message. The initial worries about belonging to a college are likely to go away over time as students become more involved with social groups on campus that interest them, and later find friends with the same interest. Here the student is forecasting that she's in her senior year of high school. She's forecasting the difficulties that she'll experience and ways to overcome them when she arrives in college. In the same schools in the charter network, 39% of kids stayed full-time college enrolled in the first year. In our control group, 38% did. In the intervention group, 55% did. That's a 17% boost, and that is 6.8 times larger than the effect of a $3,500 scholarship. In the second study, we look at collaboration with a large public university. In this study, has a dropout problem, especially among minority and first-generation students. And a good predictor of on-time graduation is enrollment in the first semester. So the key outcome here is going to be enrollment in the first semester. 91% of the incoming class, 7,300 students, completed randomized materials on the orientation website. They completed either control materials, belonging materials, or growth mindset materials. So they look in their online website. After doing the vaccine requirement, before looking at the honor code, they completed our survey, which randomized them to condition. Here's the data among the African American, Latino, and first-gen students who was able to maintain full-time enrollment in the first semester. Among advantaged students, this number is about 89%. In the prior 2 years, for the disadvantaged students, it was 83%, control condition 82%, and belonging 86%, mindset 87%, and the combined mindset plus belonging condition 86%. So this one-time summer online intervention reduced the achievement gap here in full-time first semester enrollment by about half. That's a 51% reduction. Finally, at a selective private university with a large team, including Shannon Brady and others at Stanford, we looked at the achievement gap in terms of GPA. This was a study with 92% of the incoming students, 1,600 students. We looked on the orientation website again, a control group, and three different variants of a belonging intervention. If we look first at advantaged students, there's no difference between control and treatment. If we look at our disadvantaged students in the control group, even though we're controlling here for high school academic records, there's a significant achievement gap, a gap that has been called lawful in American education. Even controlling for SAT, ACT scores, minority students and first-gen students are getting 0.2 grade points worse than advantaged students. All three variants of the belonging treatment raised students' grades, including, of course, the combined condition then. And again, this is about a 50% reduction in the achievement gap. Okay, so how is this possible? How could interventions like this have these effects? A really important point that Jeff made is that psychological interventions don't just stay in the head, they become social reality. So worries about things psychological, worries about things like belonging and ability, have direct effects on the social reality that people live in. They have effects on whether or not people are able to build relationships or develop mentor relationships. And that in turn has direct effects on education outcomes. If you have friends in school, it's a lot easier to stay engaged and do well. And in turn, these things feed back on themselves. If you have friends, you're more likely to feel you belong. If you're doing well in school, you're more likely to feel you belong. You're more likely to have friends. So in the final data, as an example of this, we asked students in the spring term, have you been able to make friends in college in their first year? The belonging condition increased that for disadvantaged students. They're more likely to make close friends. Have you been able to develop a mentor relationship? Then they're more likely to be able to say they've developed a mentor relationship. And you put those together as a kind of measure of social engagement, and it's highly significant. I want to just close by returning to Michelle. Michelle wrote recently from a White House press release, when I first arrived in college as a first-gen student, I didn't know anyone on campus but my brother. I didn't know how to pick the right classes or find the right buildings. I didn't bring the right size sheets for my dorm. So I was a little overwhelmed and a little isolated. But then I had the opportunity to participate in a 3-week on-campus orientation program. I discovered the Cultural Center, the Third World Center. I found students and staff who came from families and communities similar to my own. They understood what I was going through. They were there to listen when I was feeling frustrated. They were there to answer questions I was too embarrassed to ask. She found herself ultimately in the right psychological place to take advantage of those resources that allowed her to succeed in college. And what we need to do is we need to both help students get in that right psychological place where they can reach out, find resources, and develop relationships, and make sure that those appropriate services are available for students. So worries about belonging and other psychological worries can prevent students from getting embedded in school in ways they need to succeed. But these interventions are really much more. Jeff used the catalyst metaphor. Here's another metaphor. They're more like engine oil than an engine. They grease a complex system to allow it to function more effectively. They help students reach out and actually take advantage of services, support services, of mentor opportunities available to them. In this way, they complement other kinds of educational reforms. And in doing this work, it's essential to have interventions that actually speak to students' experiences in the school, and this can often involve optimizing materials. Thank you very much.
All right. I think this is me. Yeah. Okay. All right. Good evening. I'm the only thing that's keeping you from drinks or whatever comes after dinner, maybe. This is an extraordinary set of programs of research that have incredible potential for transforming what we do in our nation's schools. And it's truly a privilege to be on the podium, on the agenda, with this group of investigators. The work I'm doing, coming at this from, in essence, the other side. That is, we're actually looking at the work that's occurring in schools where students are succeeding and where they're not, and thinking about how this kind of research, the theorizing, the carefully thought out interventions, can be integrated productively into what students and teachers do, and how educational environments are designed to actually promote much better outcomes, much greater reliability at scale. What we know from this research is that there's a broad array of social psychological phenomena that are malleable. We know that these, what might broadly be called mindsets, are framed by experience and can be changed by skillfully crafted interventions. This is incredibly promising work. Presumably, these effects, in turn, will be moderated, either amplified or attenuated by subsequent experiences. This is a different way of saying the context in which this work occurs really matters, which you heard over and over again. So in the work we're doing, it's really around trying to figure out how do we exploit these insights to assure that we get more of the amplification and less of the attenuation in our nation's classrooms and schools. The particular problem context in which we're working on trying to draw in this work focuses on community colleges and what is the single most significant gatekeeper to opportunity in community colleges, which is the assignment of large numbers of students, typically 60 to 70%, are assigned upon entry in community colleges to developmental math. Some people might call remedial math. Upwards of 80% of the students who are assigned there never get out. If you never acquire college-level math credits, you can't transfer to a four-year institution. Your pathway to a vocational or occupational training program is also blocked. This is literally where aspirations for a better life come to an end. And we send 500,000 students down this pathway every year. So now we're trying to figure out, given that we have these extraordinary high failure rates in this context, what are the causes for it? Through a kind of complicated set of, what do we know from research and lots of focus groups, kind of our own version of the Design Institute work that Greg talked about, trying to come to deep understandings, in this case, of what's the problems plural, we're trying to solve? Well, some of these are pretty straightforward. Normal sequence of courses, it's actually a sequence of courses that are can be taken over several years. We lose more students between the transitions than fail within them. So that immediately suggests something about compacting the experience. You heard David Yeager talk about the course material and its issues of its relevance and interest and how engagement it is. So we ought to think about how do we deal with that issue. For some students, there are serious literacy and language barriers that come into the way of learning in mathematics. So that's a third big driver. The fourth one touches most directly on the work that we've heard about today is this set of student mindsets that undermines student success. And how do we actually draw upon this kind of research in response to this problem? And then the last one is that students typically are gone before we know it, that they're disengaging very early on in their academic experience in these classrooms. They feel like they don't belong. If they feel like they don't belong, they fail to commit the kind of effort necessary to succeed. They therefore don't succeed, and they're out the door. So how do we actually identify students earlier on and perhaps target much more explicit attention to those who are most at risk not to progress? So that's the kind of analysis of the problem, and this analysis of the problem eventually led us to this, what we call our productive persistence driver. So we organize all of this, thinking about this very concrete problem solving, that in the colleges when we began this work, 5% of the students who got assigned to developmental math achieved college math credits in 1 year, and 16% did it in 2 years. The target for the improvement work with this network of what is now 55 colleges is, could we get it to 50% success rate in 1 year? And what would it take to accomplish it? With one of the principal drivers, and the one I'll focus on, is this whole area of what we call productive persistence, which is really trying to draw on these lines of research that you heard about this afternoon to actually focus on the kinds of skills and mindsets that students need to actually persist to successful completion. So we have this primary driver, productive persistence, sits in essence as an intermediate target. We want to introduce a whole set of changes in the kinds of experiences that students have to increase their productive persistence so that subsequently it will lead to actual successful completion of this year-long program of study. So that leads immediately to the question of, well, if we're trying to improve productive persistence, we got to get kind of specific as to what we think it actually means. What are the key ideas to focus attention on here? And here's a place where, the academic research was incredibly helpful at framing the work, but it was also a little bit part of the problem. Because if you actually review all of this literature under what might broadly be called motivation and engagement, you will find a vast array of different sub-concepts. In fact, it was actually work that David Yeager had done with us, found 40 different sub-concepts that actually appear in this literature for which there is some empirical evidence. Well, thinking about sort of practical action, nobody can carry around 40 ideas in their head. So in essence, one of the tasks then in trying to take practical action is to figure out what are the 4, 5, 6 big core ideas that are embedded in all this work, where especially we have evidence that these things are malleable, that we might actually focus attention on in building constructive action in this work in community colleges. Related to that is, in addition to the 5 concepts, and the 3 that we've principally focused on, is this mindset about the value of mathematics, the issues around social belonging that Greg was talking about, and also this notion about whether mathematics is whether one has a fixed conception of mathematics ability or has a growth mindset. So those are the 3 principal areas in which we've been working. But if you're going to work in this area, and it's an intermediate target, you have to be able to get measures of this. What are we actually going to look at if we introduce changes? What should we see as a result of those changes? And if those things are changing, are they actually linked to the outcomes we care about? And this isn't now, the difference here from my colleagues is this isn't a research study. This is practical activity. We're trying to figure out what information we can embed into the day-to-day work, in this case of of community college classrooms so that we can actually learn from this activity to improve. So again, in this literature, there's we found over 1,000 different survey items that had been used in some empirical research. Well, we knew we weren't going to do a 1,000-item survey. And then kind of switching into our design hats and working with the community college faculty, we want to be able to get this information on the first day of instruction. So the question then becomes, how much time in that first class can we reasonably expect to be put aside to gathering information? And eventually the answer comes back, you got 3 minutes. So that transforms, 3 minutes, you can ask maybe 25 questions. So it transforms the practical measurement task. When you look at all of what we know about what we think matters in terms of shaping students' productive persistence, what's the 25 most important questions to ask? And both the conceptualizing work and the measurement work has this kind of dual dimension to face validity tests. It has to be well anchored in the kind of research you heard about today, but it also has to capture the meaning, the understandings that students have, and it's got to have face validity to the faculty in whose classrooms all of this work is going to be occurring. I want to just quickly sketch out a little bit one part of the productive persistence work that for each of the lavender things we call primary drivers, the light green things are secondary drivers. So with regard to productive persistence, there actually are 5 strands of work that are now operating in which we're trying to draw on these various research findings. And one of which is this focus on starting strong. Since we know students tend to disengage very early on, let's figure out how we can use this to create the strongest possible experience for students in those first couple of weeks. So that suggests focusing attention, for example, on the opening lessons, dealing with issues of interest, relevance that we heard about matters. We embed in that first week the direct intervention that actually started with the work of Carol Dweck and that David Yeager subsequently helped us modify to try to foster a growth mindset in students. So that's another part of what we bring in. A lot of attention to what actually happens in the classrooms, the activity structures in those environments, so that they become socially more supportive for students, so that the organization of the classroom and the work of the faculty actually promotes student social belonging. So we take some of the onus off of the student on creating the belonging and put it into the environment to foster that. And then, of course, also, how does this get embedded in the professional development support, since so much of the signals that students are receiving are being mediated through what faculty are doing. There is this design development orientation to all of this work about trying things quickly, being minimally intrusive, and developing some empirical warrant. And I'll just say briefly that we're actually doing that the inquiry part of this, how we're actually engaged in this continuous improvement, actually has 3 strands to it. Some of what we're doing might be thought of as translational research. That was the case with the growth mindset intervention, where we took a direct intervention that came directly out of this research program, and we tried to figure out how would you integrate this into a community college setting. So that's one way in which we learn. Another way in which we learn about this is that we are collecting some common data across all students in all classrooms, and by analyzing patterns of variation in those data, I'll show you just a couple of those, we're learning about where we're succeeding and where we're not, and where subsequent activity should occur. And then the third form of this is actually at the very micro level of routines that are occurring in classrooms, things that faculty might do, ways in which they might organize the learning environments in their classrooms to better support students' productive persistence. So these are very small, what are called plan, do, study, act cycles that faculty are engaging in. In terms of I'll jump over the mindset one, I talked about that already. In terms of the network, the learning data from the network analytics, part of this was a significant investment in this idea of starting strong. We had those 25 questions that we asked on day 1. We asked them again at the end of week 4, and if the Starting Strong package were working, if we're interpreting the theory properly and engaging it in the design of instruction, these activity structures, what we ought to see is basically what we see here. Students' interest in math was up. The extent to which they subscribed to a fixed mindset decreased, their anxiety had decreased, and their uncertainty about belonging in this environment had also decreased. We had a signal that we were at least on the right path in trying to absorb some of these, but these data also are useful for a second purpose. We call predictive analytics. And for this, we took the way students responded, there were little clusters of items in these 25, and did a very simple 5-element scoring of them, an at-risk index. Students who came out highly at risk in terms of what they told us in these 3-minute surveys on day 1 were twice as likely to fail the end-of-term exam as students who came out not at risk. And the single most, Craig I think liked this one, I think he's actually seen this one, the single most predictive item of whether or not students persisted to the end of the semester or whether they dropped out was their response to this question: how often, if ever, do you wonder, maybe I don't belong here? And you can see that the effects were especially large for African American students. So what data like this tells us in the context of the work we're doing in community colleges is Starting Strong package was actually seemed to be working. We know actually from the outcome data that half of the students who started down the Statway pathway achieved college-level math credit in 1 year. So we tripled the success rate in half the time, but the data tell us we can and should be doing better because there's some subsets of students for whom the experience still is not as strong as it should be. So in that place, that's one of the places now where we're engaging in these, where the faculty in the community college networks are now engaging in additional small tests of change, trying to figure out how we can do better for these students as well. Let me just jump to the end since we are running late on time. And let me just go to my closing slide, which is really talking about carrying this work forward. The programs of research that are going on here, as well as the kind of applied applications of this work that we're doing through the Carnegie Foundation, has really begun to generate enormous interest across the field. And with the support of the Rakes Foundation, we are now beginning to launch at the Foundation a network of networks around what we call promoting productive persistence. Rakes Foundation calls student agency, and since they're paying for it, we now call it student agency. But where we're actually now be working with groups across the whole spectrum, from at least middle grades all the way through to community colleges and perhaps 4-year institutions as well, on this same issue of how do we translate what we're learning from these extraordinary research programs into differences in direct interventions that students have, differences in the way faculty engage students, differences in the way activity structures are created in classrooms and educational environments to really make a difference for all of our nation's children. This is being done as a collaborative effort in which the work will be organized around common frameworks, common measures, and the activity will operate under what we call this broad spectrum of a networked improvement community. And the thing that is actually so exciting about this work is that our neighbor on the hill on the Stanford campus is the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences, and many of the panel members here will now be part of a scholars network that'll be convening regularly at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences. And so we'll be having an extraordinary opportunity to learn firsthand and very quickly about what's coming out of the best scholarship in the field, and then operating in a broad sense as a translational laboratory with community college faculty, teachers in middle schools and high schools, trying to figure out how do we actually bring this to bear to work reliably at very large scale across a large number of different contexts. And I'll stop there. We have lost our chair. David Yeager had to catch an airplane. I'll be shortly leaving to catch a train. But we do have a few minutes if there are any questions before we convene. End, rather. Sorry.
Just seeing if this is on. Hi, I'm Keith Harrison, Associate Professor at the University of Central Florida, and I'll be quick. I know we're over on time. I first want to thank AERA and all the organizers for this session. It talked about changing the world. It did for me. Thank you to all the panelists for validating. I do work on non-cognitive factors of student athletes, and our athletic incubator teaches me those lessons. I'm a former football player in the center. Jeff and Greg, you have a chapter in the book, Stereotype Threat. We're all in the book with my good friend Jeff Stone. It's nice to see you all in person. Duckworth, all the rest of you. I mean, this is just great. And so I do have a question. I know people ramble and they don't have a question, but thank you all for validating the practical award that we give at the University of Central Florida through the nonprofit Scholar Baller. We give it to student athletes that improve. These are special admits. These are folks that barely got in on their academic achievements, but they got in through their athleticism. And I can tell you after 8 years of giving the award, they're all stories of non-cognitive factors. All of them. I mean, I keep all the bios. So my question is, do you have any suggestions for the little body of literature we have for student athletes in terms of non-cognitive factors and validating self-affirmation in terms of them being a baller, being an athletic person, but how that can be channeled into academic pursuits?
Thanks for the question. Well, off the cuff, I think one possibility is I've always thought that it's very interesting how grit and self-control are sort of domain specific, that, a person can be very persistent and tolerant of rejection, for instance, in the domain of athletics, and sort of dust themselves off and try harder, try again. But then in the domain of academics, that first bad grade, they fold. And so one possibility that I think might be very interesting to explore in the case of athletics is trying to get people to import from athletics the grit and the self-control and the tolerance of rejection and the resilience that they have in one domain into the academic sphere. And I think that's a really interesting thing to play. People have talked about how great coaches have changed their lives and put them on a different trajectory. And I think part of the reason is these sort of general lessons that these coaches can instill that actually go beyond the sports that they're participating in.
That gets into Duckworth's work.
I'll just say very quickly that when I was a senior at Harvard, there was a report out that students who were admitted on athletics, right, had SAT scores that were lower than the other kids. And I think that just reinforced this idea that the scholars on campus who were admitted who were not athletes had a very different sense of belonging than the students who were admitted on athletics. But I'll tell you that, interestingly, when you follow up those students who were admitted to Harvard based on athletics, they actually, on many metrics, including income, do better than the other students. And I'm really fascinated by this idea that if students who come because they are awesome athletes and therefore know all about grit, self-control, and deliberate practice could fashion an identity which says, not only do I belong here, like I'm awesome. And so I think that actually what Jeff is saying is exactly what we'd love to see tested out in a more systematic way.
Thank you all so much.
Another question looks like over here.
Well, since everyone looks ready to go, maybe I'll just phrase my question as a request. It was really amazing to see such a huge succession of interventions, and I'm really curious how you're going to be combining them in the future. So when you do, please be sure to have this kind of event again.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That seems like a good note to end on. I think we are half an hour over time or something, like 20-some minutes over time. I wonder whether we might linger if folks have individual questions and emancipate the rest of you
Great point
to your
to stop.
days.
Let us close the session here. One more round of applause for all the